A sense of loss that already loomed over him. His career felt stagnant, and he often blamed his lack of progress on factors beyond his control, finding scapegoats in those around him. As Lawson patrolled, a car passed him, a dark sedan that caught his attention. With no clear reason, his mind quickly filled with suspicion. He watched as the vehicle made a turn and decided to follow it. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his pulse quickened. The car stopped at a gas station, and Lawson pulled in behind it. Stepping out of his patrol car, he adjusted his belt and approached the vehicle with a determined gait. Inside sat Olivia, calmly refueling her car. She noticed him immediately, but chose to ignore the imposing figure coming her way. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lawson said in a sharp tone, his voice cutting through the night air. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Olivia glanced at him briefly, her demeanor calm but firm. "I'm refueling my car, officer. Is there a problem?" Lawson narrowed his eyes, his suspicion deepening. "Mind showing me your ID? This area isn't exactly the safest for someone like you to be out alone." Olivia froze momentarily at his words, the implication clear. She reached into her pocket and retrieved her ID, handing it to him without a word. As Lawson examined the card, his expression shifted slightly, but his suspicion lingered. "This ID checks out," he muttered, his tone begrudging. "But why are you driving around here so late?" "Officer, I'm on my way home after work," Olivia replied, her voice measured, "and unless there's a specific reason for this interrogation, I'd like to continue my evening." Lawson hesitated, struggling to reconcile the situation. His prejudice clouded his judgment, making it difficult to accept that the woman before him could be anything but suspicious. "I'll need to search your car," Lawson said abruptly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Olivia's patience wavered. "On what grounds?" she asked, her gaze locking with his. "You have no probable cause." "Don't get smart with me," Lawson snapped, his frustration surfacing. "Just do as I say." Olivia took a deep breath, her composure unwavering despite the tension. She knew this was a moment that could escalate dangerously, but she also understood the importance of standing her ground. "Officer, I suggest you think carefully about your actions," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I am Captain Olivia Adams of the City Police Department. If you continue down this path, it will not end well for you." Lawson froze, the weight of her words crashing down on him. His face paled as the reality of the situation sank in. He glanced at her ID again, this time with trembling hands, and confirmed the truth he had been too blind to see. I didn't realize," he stammered, stepping back. You didn't realize because you didn't want to," Olivia interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "You let your biases guide your actions, and you assumed the worst about me without cause. This behavior is unacceptable for anyone, let alone a police officer." Lawson stood in stunned silence, his mind racing. The enormity of his actions weighed heavily on him, and he struggled to find the words to respond. "You're lucky I'm not filing a formal complaint," Olivia continued, her gaze unwavering. "But let this be a lesson. The next time you approach someone, remember that your badge is supposed to represent justice, not prejudice." Without waiting for a reply, Olivia turned back to her car, finished refueling, and drove off into the night, leaving Lawson standing alone in the gas station lot. The encounter left him shaken, his confidence shattered by the realization of his own deeply ingrained biases. As Olivia drove away, she couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. It was a painful reminder of the challenges she faced daily, even as someone who had worked tirelessly to rise above the prejudice that sought to define her. But it also strengthened her resolve to keep fighting, for herself and for the countless others who faced similar struggles. She was determined to create a future where moments like this would be relics of the past, a testament to the change she had helped bring about. Hidden lie. "I don't see how that's relevant, officer," she replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. "But yes, I live within city limits. Is there a reason you're questioning me?" Lawson didn't flinch. His hand rested on his belt, inches away from his gun, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Olivia. He ignored her question and gestured toward her car. "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he wasn't really asking. Olivia inhaled deeply, her frustration mounting. "I'm sorry, officer, but unless you have probable cause or a warrant, I don't believe you have the right to search my car," she said, maintaining her composure. "I'm just here to get gas and head home after a long day." Lawson's expression hardened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he perceived as beneath him. "You seem awfully defensive," he shot back. "Most people cooperate if they've got nothing to hide." Olivia felt her patience fraying. She knew the script by heart, the loaded questions, the insinuations, the power play, but tonight she was too tired to entertain it. "I'm not being defensive, officer. I'm asserting my rights, as any citizen should." For a moment, the two officers stood in tense silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Olivia could feel Lawson's suspicion intensify, his prejudices clearly clouding his judgment. "Wait here," Lawson finally said, retreating to his patrol car. Olivia watched him go, her mind racing. She considered revealing her rank then and there, but something stopped her. She wanted to see how far he would go, how deeply his biases ran. As Lawson sat in his car, pretending to run her plates, his mind churned. He was irritated that she wasn't intimidated, that she spoke with authority. It didn't sit right with him, and the bitterness he carried with him every day fueled his determination to find something, anything, that would justify his actions tonight. Meanwhile, Olivia stood by her car, her hands steady despite the storm brewing within her. She had endured years of prejudice, from overt racism to subtle microaggressions, and she had risen above them all. But this, being treated like a criminal while in uniform, felt like a new low. When Lawson returned, his face betrayed his frustration. "Your plates check out," he said flatly, as though disappointed not to have found anything incriminating. "But you still haven't explained what you're doing out here." Olivia let out a slow breath, her anger finally breaking through her professional facade. "I don't owe you an explanation beyond what I've already given, officer," she said, her voice sharp now, "and if you're finished wasting both our time, I'd like to get home." Lawson stiffened, his hand twitching near his belt again. "Watch your tone," he warned. "You're awfully close to obstructing an officer. That was it. Olivia had reached her limit. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her eyes locked onto his. "And you're awfully close to misconduct, officer," she shot back. "Do you know who I am?" Lawson blinked, caught off guard by her sudden shift in demeanor. "I don't care who you are," he spat. "Right now you're just a suspicious person in a high-crime area, and I'm doing my job." Olivia reached into her pocket, slowly and deliberately, and pulled out her badge. She held it up for Lawson to see, her gaze unwavering. "Captain Olivia Adams," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I lead the precinct you report to, and if you're doing your job, officer, you're doing it poorly." Lawson's face drained of color as her words sank in. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Olivia didn't give him time to recover. "Let me make something clear," she continued, her voice steady and authoritative. "You stopped me tonight because you saw a black woman in a place you didn't think she belonged. You let your bias dictate your actions, and you escalated a situation that didn't need escalation. That's not just poor judgment. It's dangerous. And it's unacceptable. Lawson took a step back, his hand falling away from his belt. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a freight train, his confidence shattered. I didn't realize, he stammered, but Olivia cut him off. No, you didn't, she said sharply. And that's the problem. You didn't realize because you didn't care to look beyond your prejudices, and now you're going to have to answer for it. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Lawson looked down at the ground, shame and fear washing over him. Olivia took a step back, her anger still simmering, but tempered now by a sense of purpose. Consider this your warning, she said. But know this. I'll be filing a report, and if I ever hear about you pulling a stunt like this again, I'll make sure you face the full consequences. Do you understand me? Yes, Captain, Lawson mumbled, his voice barely audible. Good, Olivia said, turning back to her car. She got in, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Lawson standing in the harsh glow of his patrol car's lights, a man undone by his own biases. Olivia resisted the urge to roll her eyes. It's a first aid kit, she said, her voice calm but firm. Standard issue for any officer or responsible adult, really. Lawson hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to press further. He unzipped the kit and rifled through it, finding nothing but medical supplies. Still, he lingered, as though determined to uncover something that justified his actions. Is this necessary? Olivia finally asked, unable to suppress her frustration. You've searched my car, questioned me without cause, and found nothing. I think we're done here. Lawson zipped the kit back up and closed the trunk, stepping back with a reluctant air. His posture remained rigid, his eyes scanning her one last time, as though trying to salvage his authority from the situation. You should be careful around here, he said, his tone lacking any genuine concern. People in this neighborhood aren't always who they seem. Olivia's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to his bait. Thank you for your advice, Officer Lawson, she replied coolly. I'll take my chances. Lawson gave a short, dismissive nod before turning back to his patrol car. He paused momentarily, as though expecting Olivia to offer some form of gratitude or apology. When none came, he opened his car door and slid into the driver's seat. Olivia watched him pull away, her heart pounding with residual anger and frustration. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. Encounters like this weren't new to her, but they never got easier. They were reminders of the systemic issues she had spent her career trying to combat, both within and outside the force. As the tail lights of Lawson's car disappeared into the distance, Olivia turned back to her own vehicle. She closed the trunk, adjusted her uniform, and got into the driver's seat. For a moment she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel tightly, the weight of the encounter settling over her like a heavy fog. She had worked so hard to prove herself in a profession that often seemed intent on reminding her that she didn't belong. Tonight was just another chapter in a long, exhausting story. But Olivia knew she couldn't let moments like this define her. She was here for a reason. Her commitment to justice, her dedication to her community, and her refusal to let prejudice dictate her path. Turning the key in the ignition, Olivia took another deep breath. The engine hummed to life, and she pulled out of the gas station, determined to leave the encounter behind her. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would stay with her. Not as a scar, but as a spark, a reminder of why she had chosen this path and why she had to keep going, no matter the obstacles. As she drove through the quiet streets, Olivia's mind was already racing with thoughts of how to address the broader issues this encounter represented. She knew it wasn't enough to endure these moments. She had to find ways to change the culture that enabled them, for herself, for others like her, for the future of the force she still believed could do better. Voice lacking the authority it once held. Olivia shook her head, her gaze unwavering as she addressed him with an intensity that could cut through steel. "No," she said sharply. "You weren't just doing your job. You were abusing your power, and you know it. You didn't stop me because of a legitimate concern or suspicion. You stopped me because you saw a black woman in a nice car and decided she didn't belong. That's not policing, that's profiling." Lawson shifted uneasily on his feet, his hands fidgeting at his sides. He opened his mouth to retort but stopped himself when he saw Olivia take another step closer. "I've spent my entire career working to uphold the law, to protect and serve with integrity," Olivia continued, her voice steady but brimming with controlled anger. "And every time I encounter someone like you, someone who thinks their badge is a shield for prejudice, it undermines the trust that the community should have in us. Do you even realize the damage you've done tonight, not just to me, but to the uniform we wear?" For a moment the only sound was the faint hum of the streetlights above. Lawson's bravado had crumbled entirely, leaving him looking small and uncertain. Olivia knew he was grappling with the weight of her words, but she wasn't finished. "I'm filing a formal complaint," she declared. "You'll be held accountable for what you've done here. It's officers like you who tarnish the reputation of our force and make it harder for the rest of us to do our jobs with honor. This stops here." Lawson's face flushed red. "Captain Adams, I'd—" he began, but Olivia cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Save it," she snapped. "Your apologies mean nothing to me if they're only driven by fear of consequences. If you truly want to make amends, reflect on your actions and change them. But don't think for a second that I'm letting this slide." She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, her every step purposeful and strong. As she opened the door, she cast one final glance over her shoulder. "Remember this moment, Lawson," she said, her voice carrying a quiet but fierce authority. "And remember that the next time you act on your biases, you'll be held accountable every single time." With that, Olivia got into her car and drove off, the engine's hum breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over the gas station. The weight of the encounter lingered in the air, leaving Lawson standing alone, his thoughts a chaotic mix of embarrassment, anger, and shame. As Olivia drove away, she felt the familiar churn of frustration and exhaustion in her chest. She thought about the countless times she had faced prejudice like this, both overt and subtle, in her career and her life. Each instance was a reminder of the systemic issues she had dedicated herself to challenging. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she had refused to be a silent victim. She had stood her ground, confronted the injustice head-on, and demanded accountability. And though the road ahead remained long and fraught with challenges, Olivia knew that moments like this mattered. They were steps toward the change she so deeply believed in. The city lights blurred past her as she drove through the quiet streets, her resolve solidifying with every passing mile. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or dehumanized because of their race, gender, or identity. And she wasn't going to stop until justice prevailed. Letting out a long, measured exhale. The weight of the evening clung to her like an invisible shroud. But she knew she couldn't allow it to pull her under, not now, not ever. Her mind raced with thoughts of what needed to be done, how she would ensure that this moment wasn't swept under the rug like so many others. She leaned forward, flipping open a blank report on her computer. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began to type, her words precise, factual, and unflinching. She detailed every aspect of the encounter: Lawson's demeanor, his words, his actions, and the blatant profiling that had driven them. This wasn't just a recounting, it was a demand for accountability. Halfway through writing, there was a knock at her door. She looked up to see Lieutenant Harris, one of the few people in the department she trusted. His expression was unreadable as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I heard what happened," Harris said, his voice measured. "Are you okay?" Olivia nodded, though the question felt almost perfunctory. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone clipped, "but this isn't about me being okay. This is about what Lawson did, and what I'm going to do about it." Harris sighed, pulling a chair across from her desk. "Look, Olivia, you know how this works. Filing a complaint against another officer. It's not easy. You'll face pushback. People will question your motives, your judgment." Olivia met his gaze head-on. "I don't care about the pushback, Harris. This isn't just about Lawson or even about me. It's about a pattern, a culture that needs to change. And if I stay silent, I'm complicit." Harris studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Just know, it won't be an easy fight. But if anyone can take it on, it's you." "Good," Olivia said firmly, "because I'm not backing down." After Harris left, she returned to her report, her focus sharpened. She didn't just want to document what had happened. She wanted to make it clear that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger issue that needed to be addressed. By the time she finished, the report was comprehensive and damning. The next morning, Olivia submitted the report to Internal Affairs. The response was swift and predictable: a flurry of whispers, sidelong glances, and quiet conversations that stopped as soon as she entered the room. Some colleagues avoided her altogether, while others offered cautious words of support. She ignored the noise, her focus unwavering. A week later, Lawson was called into a formal review. Olivia wasn't present for the proceedings, but she knew her report had been a catalyst. The department couldn't afford to ignore it, not when it was so meticulously detailed and undeniably true. In the meantime, Olivia continued her work as usual, though the incident lingered at the edge of her thoughts. She knew change wouldn't come overnight, but she also knew that moments like these, moments where the truth was laid bare, were necessary to chip away at the foundation of systemic bias. Weeks passed, and while Lawson remained on the force, he was placed under scrutiny. Mandatory training sessions, close monitoring, and a marked shift in his behavior followed. Olivia didn't see it as a victory, but it was a step, a reminder that even the smallest cracks could eventually bring down a wall. One evening, as she prepared to leave the precinct, she noticed a folded note on her desk. Opening it, she found a simple message scrawled in neat handwriting. "Thank you for speaking up. It gives the rest of us hope." There was no signature, but the sentiment was clear. Olivia smiled faintly, folding the note and slipping it into her pocket. Driving home that night, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle wasn't over, but she had made her stand, and in doing so, she had reminded herself and perhaps others that the fight for justice was worth every ounce of effort. As the city lights blurred past her once more, Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a police captain. She was a force for change, a voice that refused to be silenced. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would continue to fight for a world where no one had to endure what she had. She stepped inside. James turned off the TV and rose to greet her, concern etched into his face. "You're late," he said softly, studying her expression. "Rough night?" Olivia gave a small nod and set her bag down. She let out a deep sigh, trying to collect her thoughts. "Rough doesn't even begin to describe it," she replied. her voice low but tinged with frustration. James guided her to the couch and sat beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm, but full of care. Olivia hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to begin. Then, slowly, she recounted the events of the night, the humiliation at Lawson's hands, the confrontation at the precinct, and the mixed reactions of her colleagues. She didn't hold back, letting every detail spill out as James listened attentively. When she finished, there was a long silence between them. James finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. "Liv, what you're dealing with isn't new, and it's not right. But you've always fought back, always stood up for what's right. Tonight is no different. You're doing what needs to be done." Olivia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "It's just, sometimes it feels like, no matter how much I fight, the system is too big, too resistant to change." James squeezed her hand gently. "The system might be big, but so is your impact. Every time you stand up, you make it harder for people like Lawson to keep doing what they're doing. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who comes after you." His words gave her a small spark of hope, a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. She leaned into him, closing her eyes for a moment, and let the warmth of his support surround her. Finally, she opened her eyes and glanced around her. The next morning, Olivia woke with renewed resolve. She dressed for work, her movements purposeful. As she stepped into the precinct, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her once again, but she didn't falter. Instead, she held her head high and moved with confidence. In the days that followed, Olivia's report to Internal Affairs began to ripple through the department. Meetings were held, discussions sparked, and the topic of systemic bias, once swept under the rug, was now being brought to the forefront. It wasn't comfortable for many, and resistance was inevitable, but Olivia remained steadfast. Lawson was placed under an internal review. While the outcome wasn't immediately clear, the process itself sent a message. Actions like his would no longer be ignored. For Olivia, it wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, and the hope that this would lead to meaningful reflection and change. Within her precinct, Olivia's actions inspired others. Younger officers began speaking out more, sharing their own experiences and voicing their concerns. Conversations that had long been avoided were now being held, and while not everyone agreed, the silence that had once protected injustice was beginning to crack. One afternoon, Sarah approached Olivia at her desk, a hesitant smile on her face. "I just wanted to say thank you," Sarah said, "for standing up. It's not easy, but you're making a difference." Olivia smiled back, appreciating the support. "It's not about just me," she replied. "It's about all of us. If we don't stand up, nothing changes." That evening, as Olivia drove home, she thought about how far she had come, not just in her career, but in her journey to challenge the system she worked within. She knew the road ahead would be long, filled with more obstacles and moments of doubt. But she also knew she wasn't alone. As she pulled into her driveway, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her fight wasn't over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Because for Olivia, justice wasn't just a concept, it was a commitment. And no matter how hard the journey, she was determined to see it through. Lawson sat in his apartment, the weight of the previous night's events pressing heavily on him. He replayed the encounter in his mind, his actions, and Olivia's piercing words. For the first time, he felt a crack in the armor of certainty he'd worn for so long. He sat at his kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. The anger and defensiveness he'd initially felt had subsided, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. Lawson wasn't sure what to call it. Guilt, shame, or something more complex. All he knew was that Olivia's words had struck a nerve he couldn't ignore. At his precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered about the incident, some supportive of Olivia, others quietly resentful of what they saw as an overreaction. Lawson's peers had not been shy about confronting him the night before, and those words still echoed in his mind as well. Chris Turner, one of his closest colleagues, had been particularly vocal. "You need to take a hard look at yourself, Eric," Chris had said. "This isn't just about one mistake. It's about why you made that mistake in the first place." Jessica Hall's words had been harsher still. "You've set us all back," she'd said, her eyes sharp with disappointment. "People like Olivia are fighting every day to fix the damage done by biases we're supposed to be above, and here you are making it worse." Those conversations played over and over in Lawson's mind as he sat in silence. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but for the first time, he began to wonder if he could take steps to change. Meanwhile, at Olivia's precinct, the day was buzzing with activity. Olivia had spent the morning in meetings, drafting proposals for better training programs and accountability systems within the department. She knew these wouldn't be quick fixes, but she also knew that small steps could lead to big changes over time. Sarah stopped by Olivia's office in the afternoon, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," Sarah said, placing one on Olivia's desk. "Thanks," Olivia replied with a small smile. She appreciated Sarah's quiet support. It reminded her that not everyone was indifferent to the struggles she faced. Sarah sat down, glancing at the notes scattered across Olivia's desk. "So, what's the plan?" she asked. Olivia leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. "I'm working on proposals for implicit bias training, better oversight mechanisms, and stricter consequences for discriminatory behavior. It's a lot, but it's a start." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It's ambitious, but if anyone can push it through, it's you." "Let's hope so," Olivia said, her tone determined. "Because I can't keep working in a system that refuses to acknowledge its own flaws. And I won't let this incident fade into the background like so many others." That evening, Olivia attended a community meeting at a local center, a space where officers and residents could discuss concerns and build trust. She listened to stories from community members, their experiences mirroring her own frustrations with systemic bias and unequal treatment. Olivia spoke openly about her encounter with Lawson, framing it not as a personal grievance but as a symptom of the larger problem they were all trying to address. Her honesty resonated with the room, sparking a discussion about ways to improve police-community relations. By the end of the meeting, Olivia felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Change wouldn't come overnight, but conversations like this were the foundation. Back at his precinct, Lawson made a decision. He walked into his supervisor's office and requested to be enrolled in the department's next diversity and bias training session. It was a small step, but for him it felt monumental. He didn't know if it would be enough to make amends for his actions, but it was a start toward understanding the impact of his biases. The days turned into weeks, and the incident at the gas station began to fade from public memory. But for Olivia, Lawson, and many others, it remained a turning point. Olivia's push for reform gained traction within her precinct, with more officers joining her efforts to create a fairer, more inclusive environment. Lawson, meanwhile, began to challenge his own assumptions, striving to be the kind of officer who built trust instead of eroding it. For Olivia, the road ahead was still steep, but she faced it with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she couldn't change the entire system on her own, but she also knew she wasn't alone in the fight. Together, with allies both old and new, she would keep pushing forward, one step at a time. Eric Lawson sat alone in his patrol car, wrestling with his thoughts. The confrontation with Olivia the night before lingered in his mind. Her words echoed relentlessly. You didn't need to mean to. Your bias, your actions, they're the product of a system you've chosen to follow without ever questioning it. Lawson couldn't shake the weight of her truth. He had never stopped to examine his quick judgments or the norms he'd accepted within the police force. Now, faced with Olivia's piercing honesty, he couldn't escape the realization that he had been wrong. As he entered the precinct that morning, Chris Turner approached him, his expression firm yet not unkind. "Eric," Chris began, "have you thought about what happened? Are you just going to let it slide, or are you going to do something to change?" For once, Lawson didn't respond with defensiveness. He looked at Chris and admitted, "I don't know, but I think it's time I tried to understand more about what I did and why." Chris nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Start today," he urged. "Don't just assume you're doing the right thing because you wear the uniform. Make sure you're doing the right thing because of who you are." At her precinct, Olivia convened a meeting with her trusted colleagues. She knew that systemic change couldn't happen overnight, but she believed it had to start somewhere. "We're not just law enforcers," she said, her voice a steady mix of authority and compassion. "We're role models for the community we serve. That means we have to confront the biases and injustices within our system and work to change them." The meeting led to actionable steps: organizing training sessions on implicit bias, creating protocols to monitor officer behavior during community interactions, and establishing safe spaces where officers could openly discuss and learn from their mistakes. These efforts were small but significant strides toward fostering accountability and understanding within their department. In the weeks that followed, Olivia continued to advocate for reform, while participating in larger discussions about systemic change within the police force. Her voice, shaped by her own experiences, became a rallying call for justice that extended beyond the badge. For Olivia, justice wasn't just about apprehending criminals, it was about building a system that was fair and just for everyone. Meanwhile, Lawson began attending the training sessions Olivia had spearheaded. At first he was hesitant and unsure of what he might gain, but gradually he opened himself to the process. He listened, reflected, and started to grasp that real change didn't come from justifying mistakes, but from acknowledging and learning from them. During one session, Olivia addressed a group of young officers. Her gaze was steady as she said, "Justice isn't something we impose on others. It's something we must practice within ourselves. Every day is a chance to do better, to be someone the community can truly trust." In the back of the room, Lawson sat quietly, listening intently. His expression revealed a subtle but undeniable shift. The journey he had begun was difficult but necessary, and for the first time he understood what it meant to truly serve and protect. The story of Olivia and Lawson remains open-ended, filled with hope and a powerful message. Change begins with the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to doing what's right, not just for oneself, but for the community and future generations.